Good morning, everyone. Today our story is called A Giant Staircase to Heaven, and it's found in Genesis 11. Noah and his family lived in the land, and his children had children, and those children had more children, and then those children had even more. Well, you get the picture. Until there were lots of people on earth once more. Now back then, everyone spoke exactly the same language, so you didn't need to learn Swahili or Japanese or anything, because you could say hello to anyone and they knew what you meant. One day, everyone was talking and they came up with an idea. Let's build ourselves a beautiful city to live in. It can be our home, and we'll be safe forever and ever. Then they had another idea. Let's build a really tall tower to reach up to heaven. Yes, they said, we'll say, look at us up here, and everyone will look up at us, and we'll look down on them, and then we'll know we are something. We'll be like God. We'll be famous and safe and happy, and everything will be all right. So they got to work. Brick by brick, the tower grew higher and higher until it soared above the city, touching the sky. They built stairs in the tower to climb to the top. It was like a giant staircase to heaven. Look, they cheered, we're the ones. See what we can do with our very own hands? They were quite pleased with themselves. But God wasn't pleased with them. God could see what they were doing. They were trying to live without Him. But God knew that wouldn't make them happy or safe or anything. If they kept on like this, they would only destroy themselves. And God loved them too much to let that happen. So He stopped their plans. One morning, they went to work as usual, but everything was different. Their words were all new and funny. You see, God had given each person a completely different language. Suddenly, no one understood what anyone else was saying. Someone would say, how do you do? And the other person thought they said, how ugly are you? It wasn't funny. You could be saying something like, such a lovely morning, and get a punch in the nose because they thought you said, hush up, you're boring. You couldn't even say pardon to check to see if you'd heard right because no one understood that word either. It wasn't easy to work together after that, as you can only imagine. People were always quarreling and fighting and getting in a dreadful muddle and becoming grumpier and grumpier until at last they were all too cross to keep on building, and they just had to stop. After that, people scattered all over the world, which is how we ended up with so many different languages to this day. You see, God knew however high they reached, however hard they tried, people could never get back to heaven by themselves. People didn't need a staircase, they needed a rescuer, because the way back to heaven wasn't a staircase, it was a person. People could never reach up to heaven, so heaven would have to come down to them, and one day it would.
All right, well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you are warm, and I hope that you are safe. I know that we've got some folks that are in the hospital right now, and so certainly hope that you'll be praying for them, and we'll be posting those prayer requests and the things that are going on Facebook, so be checking that out. If you need us for anything during this time, I'm sure that we can get people the help that they need one way or another. So if you need us for anything or need anything, please reach out to me or the deacons, and we'll do what we can to help. As for the message today, we're going to kind of keep on keeping on with what we've been doing on Sunday mornings. Today, I told them Wednesday night, I've sort of learned when it comes to video messages that sometimes less is more. And so I'm going to work really hard to keep this under 15 minutes. And if you can work really hard to focus for 15 minutes, I think we'll all benefit from it. But I want to do two things. One, I want to let you know what we're doing on Sunday mornings, because if you haven't been with us, you may not know. Starting in January, we began using something called the Jesus Storybook Bible, just as a guide for what we're doing on Sunday mornings. And and that sounds like a very generic name, the Jesus Storybook Bible, but it's anything but generic. And if you'd show up and hear these Bible stories being read, I think you would understand what I mean. But we have volunteers who come up before I preach every Sunday. They sit in a chair on the stage, and the kids gather around them, and the story is read from the Storybook Bible. Then the kids run off to children's church, where they have a curriculum built around the story they just read. And we, out in the sanctuary, look at the corresponding scripture that goes along with that story. And we just kind of break it down and look for some of the heavier hitting things that maybe the children's storybook Bible doesn't address. And so if you haven't listened to Miss Angie read the story for today, I hope you'll go back and do it. You'll find that it's a familiar story for most of us. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. And like most children's storybook Bibles, it does kind of leave out some of the heavier things. I think it nails some of the more important things, but there are some things that it doesn't really focus on that I think we can sort of glean from the text itself. And so I want to begin the message today by reading it to you, Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, and then I'll give you some context for where it is and some things that I would hope you would notice. But Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. The whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. As people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make oven-fired bricks." They used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let's make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered throughout the earth." Then the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the humans were building. The Lord said, "If they've begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So from there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it is called Babylon. For there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth. So again, this is Genesis chapter 11, and everything that's happened in Genesis is leading up to this moment. Just to give you some highlights, in Genesis chapter 3 is the first rebellion, right? That's when Adam and Eve are tempted, and the temptation really was to be like God. That if they disobeyed God, they would be like God. It was the great lie that somehow God was holding them back, and meanwhile God had created them to reflect Himself, right? But they missed the point, and as a result they fell, and so that was the first rebellion. And then Cain and Abel, the story that quickly follows as Cain kills his brother, and Cain was very focused on again making a name for himself. He was very focused on glorifying himself, especially as compared to his brother. When his brother he offered a sacrifice that was pleasing to God, Cain did not. Cain was offended by that, and he wanted to make himself great. And so did subsequent generations after him. And that's why by the time we get to Genesis chapter 9, society built the way Cain would have it built was completely corrupt. God had become an afterthought. And so God decides in that moment, or if God decides anything, God planned this from the beginning, but in that moment, God announces that He's going to destroy the earth and with a flood, and that Noah is the one that is going to now repopulate the earth. And so he has three sons. The story sort of continues with their lineage, and it's directly linked to what happens here. One of the place that's mentioned in this text is a place called Shinar, the land of Shinar. And this is a region in Mesopotamia. Later on, north of this area, there would be an empire that developed called Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, would be the leader of that empire. And the text also tells us that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon came out of Shinar. As did Noah's grandson Nimrod, who was wicked, and that whole lineage, if you look at it, is just sort of a who's who of wicked individuals, and so these individuals that now are building this tower at Babel are descended from those people, and so they use this phrase, and I think it's worth pointing out in the first 4 verses, it looks like 3 times, some version of this phrase, come let us, come let's, or let's do this or let's do that. And that phrase really, I think, is a counterfeit version of what God said in the creation story when he said, come let us make man in our image. And so they're imitating God in a way, but it's a distorted way. And so 3 times they say this because what they're doing is they're making a name for themselves. In fact, the 3rd time, that is what they say, let us make a name for ourselves. Meanwhile, they were created to reflect God's glory, but now they're wanting to glorify themselves. They are very innovative, they're very technological, and they instituted those things for the development of a society. There's a lot of emphasis on the tower, and I understand why. It's interesting, but what really is the problem, I think, is not so much the tower as it is the society that has developed, that they have developed. A city, if you notice later on in the text, it says that they stopped building the city. That was what God wanted to accomplish, was to not so much stop building the tower, but stop building the city. The tower was sort of a symptom of a deeper problem. The tower, like many other civilizations at this time, was a common thing. People built towers, and it was a symbol of arrogance in a lot of cases. I don't believe they were ever literally trying to build a tower to the heavens. It was just a status symbol that they were capable of doing these things. That the tower would often become a focal point. It would sort of serve like as a temple, and certainly a focal point of their culture. Oftentimes these were called ziggurats. You may have heard that term before. In Egypt they were called pyramids, and it served the same purpose. It symbolized their own ambition and arrogance and just the notion of human ascent, to be like God, very much like Adam and Eve in the garden, that they wanted to be like God. And you see this show up in cultures in this area, in Babylon and Canaan and Sodom and Gomorrah and eventually Egypt and Rome. These were civilizations that went wrong. They didn't want to be scattered, and that was another issue. That was what they were talking about in the text, that if we don't do this, then we will be scattered. But if you remember that God had given the descendants of Noah the same instructions that he'd given Adam and Eve. He told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth. He said the same thing to the descendants of Noah. They were supposed to go out into the world. They were supposed to export his influence into the rest of the world. But they didn't want to be scattered. They didn't want to do that. So they wanted to stay put, and they wanted to glorify themselves. So this city, this society, this civilization was really as much a problem, more of a problem than the tower itself. That they were building a civilization to themselves, right? Now, in verse 5, God does something about it. God visits their big experiment, and he identifies the problem. And it's worth pointing out, too, that the problem was not that they were working together. That's a good thing. Working together is a good thing. Being creative, being innovative, being productive, those are not bad things in and of themselves. God created them to be able to do those things. The problem was they were doing those things to glorify themselves. Not to export the influence of God in the world around them, but just to glorify themselves. And so God, in verse 7, God intervenes by forcing the dispersion that was supposed to happen in the first place. And he does it by way of confusing their language. Their language was the thing that had unified them, and so God chooses to use that thing that had unified them to disperse them. And that's exactly what he does. And this is important because this sets the stage really for the rest of the Bible. Because this is where God creates a separation between himself and all humanity. And it was man's rebellion and sin that really created the separation. But God, in a way, now separates himself from humanity. Now we're gonna discover that there would be a people, Israel, but they don't exist yet. At this point in history, God simply creates a distance between himself and all humanity, and he allows them to go their own way. Much like in Romans, where in Romans 1, I think it is, where God turned them over to their own ways. And so that's what seems to be is happening here, and he allows people to live apart from his influence. And this separation would be evident in the rising up of nations that would serve other gods like Babylon and empires like Persia and Assyria and eventually again Rome. But this separation was going to be very strategic, because in the midst of these empires, God was going to raise up a people for himself. He was going to raise up a people that he would call out of this humanity that he's separated himself from. He would reach into that very humanity and call out an individual from which he would develop a people that would symbolize what it was to be in relationship with the true and living God. And he would make a name for that individual, right, that he was going to call out. And we because again in Genesis, in the very next chapter, after God distances humanity from himself, in the very next chapter, God begins the long process of bringing the gospel of Jesus to fruition. And he does it by calling one of the descendants of Noah out of Shinar, and he tells him that he will make his name great. His ancestors had wanted to make a name for themselves, but God said, if anybody's going to be great, it's not going to be because they make a name for themselves. It's going to be because I say that he's going to be great. If any man is going to be great, God says it's going to be under my direction. And he chooses a pagan man named Abram out of Shinar, who is old, and his wife is old, and he promises him that he's going to have children. It was laughable, because it was impossible, at least naturally impossible, for them to conceive children. And God says, I know, he's perfect. Because when I get done with this, everybody's going to know that Abram didn't make a name for himself. Everybody's going to know that this was by my hand, by my power, that this got done. And we're going to talk about that story next week, and that's a lot of fun, so you don't want to miss that one. But one other piece to this that I also don't want us to miss is that while God began the process of bringing the gospel to reality all the way back with Abram, part of the process of redeeming what happened at the Tower of Babel actually happens in the New Testament. You remember in Acts on the day of Pentecost when God redeems that action. And Israelites are coming to Jerusalem from all different nations. They're speaking all different languages. And then when the gospel arrives on the day of Pentecost, the text tells us that people heard the gospel in their own language. It was as if God intervened and redeemed what happened at the Tower of Babel. And what was separating everybody now, the gospel was bringing everybody back together, bringing the nations back together. Ultimately, Paul becomes an apostle to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles will be brought in. But in this moment at the day of Pentecost, I think it was a picture of redeeming what went wrong at the Tower of Babel, and how that the gospel would be a unifying force, a unifying reality. The one thing that was going to bring these people groups back together and bring things in common was going to be the gospel. And again, the language becomes familiar when they hear the gospel, even in a foreign tongue. It became familiar to them when they heard it. The story is interesting, and the tower is interesting, and there are many more details that we could cover. But I've already elapsed my 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop. Come back and be with us on Wednesday night. Come back and be with us next Sunday when we look at the story of Abram. Thank you so much for joining us now. Please reach out to us if there's anything that you need from us, and we won't hesitate to do what we can to help. Thank you. God bless. We'll be praying for you and trust that you'll be praying for us.